The tunnel had always been a quiet place, too quiet, some would say. It lay carved through a stretch of stubborn mountain rock, its aging concrete walls stained with decades of moisture, exhaust, and stories nobody wanted to remember. For years, maintenance teams treated it like a relic, something to monitor, not something to touch. But on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed with a single alert that blinked red on the supervisory control panel. A sensor buried deep within the tunnel's infrastructure had detected movement. Not vibration. Not settling. Actual movement, from behind the sealed walls. At first, the engineers dismissed it as a glitch. The sensors were old, the wiring older, and anomalous readings weren't unusual. Still, protocol required a manual review. Junior technician Aram was the first to scroll through the seismic logs. What he saw made him lean forward so sharply that his chair squeaked. The movement wasn't random, it pulsed at intervals. Rhythmic. Repeated. Deliberate. Like footsteps, slow, heavy, and impossibly measured. He hesitated before calling his supervisor. "Sir, you need to see this," he whispered, as though afraid the tunnel might hear him. Within an hour, 3 senior engineers were gathered around the monitor, their brows furrowed, arms crossed tightly over their chests. None of them spoke at first. They just watched the repeating pattern, a faint but undeniable tremor echoing through concrete that hadn't been touched since the late 1970s. Walls that had been sealed permanently, according to old records. Walls that, for reasons no one could explain, now seemed to conceal something that was moving. The head of structural integrity, Engineer Raza, finally broke the silence. "Recalibrate the system," he ordered. His voice was firm, but it carried an undertone of unease. Aram recalibrated. The readings didn't change. He ran diagnostics. Nothing changed. He switched to a secondary seismic feed. The movement was still there, steady, faint, but unmistakably alive. A cold draft drifted through the control room, even though the air vents weren't running. Aram shivered. "Maybe it's geological shifting," he offered weakly, hoping for reassurance. But Raza shook his head. "Rockfalls don't happen in perfect intervals," he replied. "And they don't repeat the same pattern for 37 minutes. Word spread quickly among the staff, but instead of curiosity, the dominant emotion was dread. The older engineers, the ones who had been around long enough to know fragments of the tunnel's unspoken history, refused to even approach the sealed section for a visual inspection. Raza called for volunteers to accompany him for a preliminary walkthrough, but every experienced member stepped back. Their silence grew louder than the alarms still blinking on the screen. Finally, one of the oldest technicians, a man named Faraz who rarely spoke, muttered under his breath, "It's happening again." No one asked him what he meant. The younger staff didn't know. The older ones didn't want to remember. When the decision was made to physically inspect the wall from a distance, just enough to verify if structural expansion was to blame, the inspectors refused. Every single one of them. Not with anger, but with pale faces and quiet, trembling voices. Some offered excuses. Others simply shook their heads as though the request itself was dangerous. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't laziness. It was fear, the deep, instinctive kind that doesn't need explaining. One engineer, a woman named Shabana, finally said what everyone else was too afraid to articulate: "Those walls were sealed for a reason. We don't know what's behind them. And we're not supposed to open them. Not again." Her wording sent a chill through the room. Again. Aram's eyes darted toward her, but before he could ask anything, Raza ended the meeting abruptly. He instructed staff to secure the area, shut down the sensor feed for maintenance, and log the incident as possible technical malfunction. But it wasn't a malfunction. Every person in that room knew it. Late that night, long after the control room had emptied, Aram returned alone. He replayed the tremor logs one more time. As he watched, the intervals shifted, growing slightly closer together. Almost like whatever was behind the sealed wall had started moving with more purpose. More urgency. Then the final reading appeared, one strong vibration, sharper than all the others. A single thud. As though something had struck the wall from inside. Aram froze. The monitor flickered. The sensor light dimmed. And in the cold, humming quiet of the control room, he felt the same sensation the senior engineers had tried to hide. This wasn't the first warning. And deep down, he could tell, it wouldn't be the last. The tunnel had always been presented as a triumph of engineering, a proud symbol of national progress carved through unforgiving mountain stone. But its creation was anything but triumphant. The story the public knew was polished, politically curated, and incomplete. The real story, the one buried under piles of forgotten blueprints and silenced testimonies, began in the late 1970s, when the government decided the mountain must be conquered, no matter the cost. Back then, the project was rushed from the moment it began. Minister Rafiq Dar, a charismatic politician with an obsession for grand infrastructure, promised the public a tunnel that would redefine transportation. But beneath his confident speeches was a man under pressure. Funding was unstable, deadlines were unrealistic, and the elections were fast approaching. A finished tunnel meant votes. Every delay meant political risk. And so, he demanded progress at all costs. The responsibility fell onto Chief Engineer Haroon Malik, a brilliant but chronically overworked man who believed firmly in procedure and safety, qualities that put him in direct conflict with the minister's urgency. Malik's team was understaffed, the geological surveys incomplete, and the equipment not suited for the rugged mountain terrain. Still, he pushed forward, because refusal meant removal, and removal meant someone far less competent, and far less cautious, would replace him. The early drilling stages were disastrous. The mountain rock was more unstable than expected, its inner layers riddled with unexpected voids and uncharted pockets. Every time the drill bored deeper, the mountain seemed to groan. Workers reported strange hollows beneath their feet and echoes that didn't match the acoustics of a solid structure. But with deadlines breathing down their necks, the crew had no choice but to continue. Among the workers were dozens of undocumented laborers, men who had traveled far, desperate for employment. They were paid little, worked long hours, and lived in makeshift cabins near the blast zone. Official records barely acknowledged their presence. Unofficially, everyone on the crew knew the laborers were the backbone of the project. They were the ones who cleared rubble, set charges, and crawled into unstable spaces the engineers themselves wouldn't dare enter. Their safety wasn't prioritized. Their absence, if it ever occurred, would hardly make paperwork. As construction deepened, Malik grew more isolated. He fought quietly with Minister Dar over structural reinforcements, ventilation shaft placement, and the alarming frequency of microcollapses. Dar dismissed his concerns every time, waving off the data with a curt, "Just find a way to make it work." But Malik's journals, unknown to everyone at the time, recorded the truth. He noted strange vibrations felt within the rock, sections where tools vanished into cracks that contained airflow, and the unsettling realization that parts of the mountain were hollow in ways no geological survey had predicted. Tension on site thickened as more anomalies appeared. Miners complained of hearing faint noises behind the drilling surface, soft knocks, distant scraping, and, on one occasion, what sounded like muffled voices. Supervisors blamed the acoustics of the machinery. Workers disagreed. They claimed the sounds continued even when the drills were powered down for the night. Some laborers refused to return to specific areas, citing bad omens. Minister Dar threatened to fire them on the spot, so they returned out of necessity, their fear swallowed whole. It wasn't just the workers who noticed strange things. Malik requested a revised geological blueprint after noticing inconsistencies between the predicted rock density and the actual readings. The revision arrived 2 weeks later, quietly, discreetly, with no official approval stamp. It showed new fault lines that nobody had charted before, a subterranean cavern system that wasn't referenced in any previous studies, and a section marked in faint, hand-drawn ink as unstable, avoid further intervention. But Malik wasn't allowed to avoid it. The tunnel's path had already been set. Diverting it meant halting progress, rebuilding support columns, and explaining cost overruns to a volatile minister. So the revision was filed away where no one else would question it. The deeper they dug, the stranger the project became. Ventilation units picked up drafts from sources that shouldn't have existed. Floodlights flickered in areas untouched by electrical faults. Workers swore they felt vibrations, slow, rhythmic ones, under the soles of their boots, like movement deep in the rock. Malik dismissed it publicly, but privately, he began to worry that the mountain wasn't empty. He just didn't yet know what filled it. And then came the silence. A moment in construction when everything seemed to pause, as though the mountain were holding its breath. That was the week 3 undocumented workers vanished from the night shift roster. Official logs claimed they had quit abruptly. But the remaining laborers whispered a different story, a collapse, a scream, and a section ordered sealed before sunrise. No bodies were recovered. No report was filed. Minister Dar insisted the incident did not occur. Malik did not protest. He had grown too tired to fight. When the tunnel finally opened to the public, Dar gave a triumphant speech on live television, praising the project as a hallmark of modernization. Cameras never showed the sealed-off corridor deep inside, hidden behind thick concrete. Nobody asked why that section was reinforced differently from the rest. Nobody questioned why the workers avoided walking near it during the inauguration ceremony. Nobody thought to ask why Malik, usually proud of his achievements, stood at the back that day, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the sealed wall as if he feared it might move. Because by then, everyone involved knew something was wrong with the tunnel. They just didn't dare speak about it, not to each other, not to officials, and certainly not to the public. Something had been buried inside the mountain that should have stayed untouched. And decades later, the sensors detecting movement behind those same sealed walls were only confirming what Malik had feared from the beginning: whatever they had built over, had never truly been silent. The first tragedy inside the tunnel was never supposed to be remembered. Not by the public, not by the government, and certainly not by the men who worked there. It happened quietly, so quietly that if not for one terrified witness, it would have vanished into the dust of the construction site like so many other unspoken accidents of that era. But the memory of it lingered in the minds of those who saw what should have been impossible. It began on a night shift when only a skeleton crew remained in the deeper sections of the then unfinished tunnel. The air was thick with drilling dust, and the only sounds were the whirring machines echoing through the rock. A young laborer named Amjad still remembers that night with a haunted clarity, like a wound that never healed. He had been working alongside another laborer, a quiet man known simply as Javed, who had taken the job to support his parents in a distant village. They were drilling through what geological reports claimed was solid rock. But the vibrations felt strange that night. Not the usual grinding resistance of stone, but something softer, almost hollow. Amjad felt it first through his boots, a faint tremor that didn't match the rhythm of the drill. He looked at Javed, who paused and pressed his ear to the rock. "There's space behind this," Javed murmured. "A chamber." Before they could alert their supervisor, a crack, a sudden, violent split, ripped across the drilling face. The ground shuddered. Loose stone rained down. Amjad leapt backward, but Javed wasn't quick enough. The wall buckled inward, swallowing him in a cloud of dust and collapsing debris. In a matter of seconds, he was gone, trapped inside a dark cavity that hadn't existed on any blueprint. The men shouted his name, but the only answer was the unsettling groan of shifting stone. When the dust settled, they found a jagged opening barely wide enough for a single man to crawl through. None of them dared. The air that drifted out was cold, unnaturally cold for a confined underground space. It carried a faint metallic scent, like old blood or rusted iron, and something else Amjad would never forget: the unmistakable smell of damp, stagnant earth that had been sealed away for a long, long time. Supervisors arrived minutes later. They sealed the perimeter immediately, forbidding anyone from entering the chamber. A rapid, hushed discussion took place, no raised voices, no panic, just controlled urgency. Then the order came, carried quietly from one foreman to the next: seal it. Cement the entire section. Now. Amjad stared at them in disbelief. Javed is alive, he insisted. We heard him shouting, he's still inside. He wasn't imagining it. Just before the supervisors arrived, he distinctly heard a muffled cry from behind the rubble. A real, desperate plea. But his protests were ignored. Minister Dar had made himself clear: delays were unacceptable. Retrieving one undocumented worker, one whose employment wasn't officially recorded, didn't qualify as an acceptable delay. Despite the workers' objections, construction crews moved in with concrete mixers. Thick, gray cement began pouring into the opening, consuming the last trace of Javed's existence. Amjad watched with helpless rage as the liquid stone filled the cavity. He could still hear faint tapping from within, weak, frantic taps, growing softer and softer until the wet concrete silenced them completely. It was the sound that stayed with him the most. Not the collapse. Not the screams. But the slow fading of those taps, as though Javed had realized, far too late, that no one was coming for him. Within hours, the incident was erased from all documentation. Workers were told to stay silent, and most obeyed. Fear and poverty were powerful restraints. But for weeks afterward, members of the night shift whispered about what they had begun hearing near that newly sealed wall. Faint knocks, irregular but unmistakable. Sometimes slow. Sometimes in quick succession, like someone desperately trying to signal. Amjad heard them most clearly. He would stop in the middle of sweeping debris, heart hammering in his chest, staring at the thick slab of concrete that now concealed the chamber. There it was again, a dull, hollow thump. Then another. He pressed his palm to the cold wall and felt a vibration, slight but intentional. The supervisors dismissed these complaints, labeling them echoes from machinery. But every night, when the tools powered down and silence settled, the knocks continued. For nearly 3 weeks they persisted, until one night, they abruptly stopped. The wall fell silent. Completely. Permanently. Some workers believed that the concrete had finally suffocated the trapped air pockets. Others believed something else, that Javed had survived far longer than anyone admitted, and that he had died alone in darkness, pounding against a wall no one would open. But in the years that followed, those knocks became the first ghost story whispered among the tunnel's older staff. A story passed quietly, cautiously, as though speaking it aloud might awaken whatever was buried in that hidden chamber. And when new movement was detected behind the sealed walls decades later, that old memory resurfaced, the one they had been ordered to forget. Because deep in their hearts, those who had been there the night Javed disappeared believed only one thing: the tunnel had never truly been quiet since. And whatever was behind those walls had not forgotten the living. Decades passed, and the tunnel aged with time. What once stood as a symbol of national pride slowly became a relic of a rushed and troubled era. The walls grew darker, the air heavier, and maintenance teams more cautious with every passing year. Most of the original crew had retired or died, only a handful of old staff members remained who knew fragments of the truth, fragments they refused to discuss. But with modernization initiatives rolling in, the government allocated funds to upgrade the tunnel's outdated infrastructure with new monitoring technology. And that decision would bring back a truth the past had tried desperately to bury. It began with the installation of seismic microsensors, small, hypersensitive devices capable of detecting even the subtlest movements within solid concrete. These weren't like the crude instruments used in the 1970s, they could differentiate between geological shifts, structural fatigue, human footsteps, and mechanical vibrations. Engineers welcomed the upgrades, though many felt uneasy when they saw the sealed-off region on the schematics. Some of the older men avoided the area entirely, eyes turning away as if the tunnel itself were watching them. Once activated, the sensors began collecting baseline data. For the first few days, everything seemed normal, typical fluctuations caused by traffic, pressure changes, and environmental conditions. Then the system started picking up subtle anomalies. At first, it detected faint rhythmic pulses near the sealed wall, barely noticeable, easily dismissed as machinery noise. But machinery didn't run at those hours. And the pattern wasn't random. One afternoon, during routine diagnostics, Dr. Layla Siddiqui, a structural engineer newly assigned to oversee the monitoring system, noticed an odd heat map formation on the digital layout. It showed faint traces of internal vibration, deep inside the wall itself. "Could be settling," she muttered, capturing screenshots. But as she zoomed in, her expression changed. Settling didn't look like this. These patterns were spaced evenly, like measured steps. Movement from a confined space. Movement that seemed to pace back and forth. She requested a second reading. The sensors confirmed it. She ran a cross-check with the thermal monitors. No anomaly. Then she checked acoustic feedback, and her pulse quickened. The acoustic signature matched the frequency of soft, rhythmic thuds. Not geological. Not mechanical. Something else. Something disturbingly close to the patterns produced by human motion. By evening, the data had grown even stranger. A cluster of seismic points indicated slow, forward-shifting movement, not downward like a collapse would suggest, but horizontal. Advancing steadily toward the outer tunnel wall. Layla called for senior engineers to review the logs. When they arrived, their faces darkened as soon as they saw the data. Not one of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Raza, the same veteran engineer who years earlier had urged staff to ignore anomalies, exhaled slowly. "It's not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's nothing behind that wall." But that wasn't true. And he knew it. One of the older technicians, who had been a young worker during the tunnel's final construction phase, stared at the heat map with trembling hands. Memories of past accidents, sealed chambers, and forbidden sections pressed against his conscience. He whispered something under his breath, "It hasn't stopped after all this time." The younger engineers exchanged confused glances, but the older staff avoided eye contact. It was clear some of them had been waiting for this day, or fearing it. In an attempt to rule out system malfunction, the team initiated a comprehensive system recalibration. Every sensor was reset, every cable checked for faults, every reading revalidated. But after the reboot, the movement returned, identical in rhythm and intensity. Layla ran the logs through predictive modeling software. The result made her skin crawl. The predicted movement patterns matched those of a confined biped organism adjusting its weight repeatedly. But the sealed space was supposed to be filled with solid concrete. No cavity. No chamber. Nothing that could accommodate movement. Unless the old documents, those buried or falsified, had left out critical information. Over the next several days, the readings intensified subtly. The steps, if they were steps, grew more frequent. The pacing accelerated. The seismic signature suggested something alive, something restless. The older engineer started avoiding that section of the tunnel entirely. Even walking past the area gave them chills. One of them remarked quietly that the air felt charged near the wall, as if vibrating faintly at a frequency beyond human hearing. Meanwhile, Layla, determined to find a rational explanation, began digging through archived documents. Most were incomplete, water-damaged, or redacted. But among them, she noticed inconsistencies, revised blueprints that didn't match the official designs, geological surveys that hinted at hollow spaces, missing records from the night shift logs during construction. Her curiosity soon turned into unease. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the control room and manually reviewed several hours of seismic recordings. The deeper she scrolled, the more disturbed she became. The rhythm of the movement changed at certain points, as though responding to sounds in the tunnel above. When trucks passed by, the tremors behind the sealed wall paused. When silence fell, they resumed. At 3:14 a.m., an especially strong tremor recorded what appeared to be a sharp impact, something striking the inside surface of the sealed wall. Layla froze. She replayed the recording again and again. It wasn't rock shifting. It wasn't pressure. It was a hit. A purposeful, deliberate hit. Footsteps. Pacing. A strike against the wall. The implications sank like lead in her stomach. If something was inside that sealed chamber, how long had it been there? How had it survived? And why was it moving now, after decades of stillness? Her thoughts spiraled as she replayed the waveforms. If it was alive, it shouldn't be. If it wasn't alive, then what was it? In the following morning's briefing, she presented the latest data to the senior staff. Their reactions were far from scientific curiosity, they were afraid, deeply afraid. One older supervisor stepped back from the screen as though the heat map itself was cursed. "We shouldn't be looking at this," he muttered. "We were told never to revisit that section." Layla pressed him. By who? And why? But he refused to answer. His silence was louder than any explanation. After the meeting, Raza pulled Layla aside. His voice shook slightly as he admitted, there were incidents. Back when this tunnel was new. Things we were ordered not to report. You need to let this go. But the data didn't stop. The movement continued. And whatever was keeping engineers away was no longer a rumor, it was becoming real, measurable, undeniable. Before leaving the control room, Layla took one last look at the sensor display. The movement had shifted again. It was no longer pacing. It was gathering toward one point, the very center of the sealed wall. As though preparing for something. Something none of them were ready to face. The meeting room felt colder than usual the morning the inspection order was issued. A quiet unease had settled into the tunnel facility ever since the seismic readings began showing movement, but now, with undeniable evidence piling up, the higher administration demanded a physical inspection of the sealed corridor. On paper, it was a simple task, a structural integrity check, routine and mandatory. But when the engineers gathered to hear the assignment, not a single one stepped forward. Their refusal wasn't loud or confrontational, it was far worse. It was quiet, unanimous, and rooted in something deeper than logic. Most of the younger engineers didn't understand why the senior staff reacted the way they did. These were seasoned professionals, men and women who had faced cave-ins, electrical faults, and pressure collapses without hesitation. But today, their faces were pale, their eyes refusing to meet the supervisor's gaze. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though an invisible weight hovered in the room, pressing against their lungs. The supervisor repeated the order. Still, silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Finally, one of the oldest engineers, Qasim, shuffled to his feet. His hands trembled as he rested them on the table. His voice cracked when he spoke, not from age, but from something closer to fear. "We're not going near that wall," he said. "Not again." His words sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. The younger staff exchanged confused glances. Again. The sealed wall was supposed to be untouched for over 40 years. What did he mean? But Qasim wasn't finished. His eyes, usually calm and steady, now glistened with something dark, memories he had spent decades trying to bury. "You all look at numbers," he said, pointing at the seismic data on the projector. "But some of us, we've heard things from behind that wall. We've seen what happens to those who went too close." His statement earned nervous murmurs, but no laughter. No one dared to dismiss him. Not when every older engineer in the room nodded subtly, confirming it. Raza, trying to regain control, insisted on explanations. This is a structural review. Nothing more. Why is everyone acting like this is something supernatural? His frustration was visible. He wasn't a man who tolerated superstition or fear-based decisions. But the fear here wasn't superstition. It was memory. One of the technicians stepped forward with trembling lips. Decades ago, he said, when the tunnel was still new, a team was sent to inspect that same wall. None of them lasted more than a week after. Some fell sick. Others disappeared. He swallowed hard before continuing. Their reports mentioned noises, scratching, low breathing, tapping. They said the wall responds. This wasn't documented anywhere. There were no official reports, no archived notes, nothing in the government files. Whatever had happened was intentionally buried. But now, after the recent seismic activity, the buried stories were resurfacing like something rising from deep water. The refusal hardened when a junior inspector, trying to prove he wasn't afraid, volunteered to do a remote walkthrough. The older staff immediately stopped him. Qasim grabbed his arm with a strength unexpected for a man of his age. "No one goes alone," he hissed. "And not near that section. Not after what we lost." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't have to. His trembling body said enough. That afternoon, the supervisors attempted a different approach. They brought out old maintenance logs, restricted ones that most staff had never seen. Redacted entries, missing timestamps, unexplained equipment failures. And strange notes, cameras that malfunctioned only near the sealed section, sensors that picked up breathing-like frequencies, oxygen levels inside the concrete that remained inexplicably stable decades after sealing. This final detail confused the younger engineers. Concrete enclosed spaces should not hold breathable oxygen for that long. It was impossible, unless the space wasn't truly sealed. Or unless something inside was altering the environment. When asked about it, the older crew members looked away. None of them wanted to discuss the implications of an oxygen-stable chamber that was supposed to be solid rock. The pressure to inspect the wall increased when the government demanded a report. Officials didn't care about strange histories or whispered warnings, they needed clear answers. But the engineers' refusal remained firm. Even threats of suspension didn't sway them. Their fear overpowered everything: fear of returning, fear of waking something, fear of repeating a mistake buried under decades of silence. One engineer, a soft-spoken father of two named Cameron, broke down in tears during the discussion. "You don't understand," he said through shaking breaths. "It's not just a wall. It's a boundary. We closed something in. Or we trapped someone in. Or," he hesitated, voice dropping to a whisper. "Or we trapped something out." His words hung in the air like smoke. A younger staff member asked the question everyone else avoided: "What did you hear back then?" But before Qasim could answer, one of the administrative officers entered the room with a file, stamped restricted. The engineers braced themselves. Inside were photos from decades ago, recovered from an old inspector's locker, smashed seismic sensors, crushed from inside the sealed chamber, concrete with deep scratches, workers standing several feet back from the wall with fear etched into their expressions. Most disturbing was a single handprint left on the wall, not a fresh one, but an imprint found beneath layers of old dust. It wasn't faint. It was pressed deeply into the concrete, fingers long, spread wide, and shaped unlike any normal human hand. Engineers recoiled. Some closed their eyes. The room went deathly still. That was the moment the refusal became absolute. No amount of authority, pressure, or threats could force them to approach that wall. They weren't protecting themselves from danger, they believed they were protecting the tunnel, and possibly the outside world, from something that should never be disturbed. In the end, the supervisors had no choice but to postpone the inspection. But postponement wasn't a solution. Not when seismic logs continued to show shifting movement. Not when the readings intensified every night. Not when the wall itself seemed to pulse with the pattern of something waking, or remembering. And certainly not when they learned that the oxygen levels inside the sealed chamber weren't just stable. They had increased. The discovery of Chief Engineer Haroon Malik's diaries did not happen through official channels. They surfaced by accident, found in a rusted metal box inside an old storage locker that was scheduled for clearing. The locker belonged to a retired supervisor who had passed away months earlier. Among his belongings were yellowed papers, cracked binders, and at the very bottom, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, Malik's personal journals. No one knew why the supervisor kept them. No one even knew they existed. But once the engineers read the first few pages, they understood why the diaries had been hidden for decades. The earliest entries were technical, notes about rock density, tunnel pressure, faulty machinery. But even in those early pages, lines of unease were woven into the writing. Malik documented vibrations that didn't match geological projections, air pockets where none should exist, and the unsettling sensation of being watched when working near the deeper sections. He wrote analytically, as an engineer, trying to rationalize what he experienced. But as the entries continued, his tone shifted from analytical to unnerved, from unnerved to frightened. One entry described him working late in the tunnel, long after the workers had left. He was doing a final walkthrough with only a lantern and a clipboard when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He turned sharply, expecting to see a worker who had stayed behind. But the tunnel was empty. He walked forward. The footsteps followed. He stopped. They stopped. Malik wrote that he had never felt fear like that in his life, not the fear of collapse or pressure failure, but the fear of something unseen moving in perfect response to his own body. Another entry revealed a moment that changed his understanding of the tunnel forever. While inspecting a recently blasted section, he noticed a narrow fissure between the rocks. A cold draft seeped through, carrying with it a sound, low, almost like breathing. He pressed his ear closer, convinced he was imagining it. But the sound grew clearer, as if something on the other side was exhaling, inhaling, exhaling again. Malik fled before verifying his findings. He tried to report these anomalies to Minister Dar, but Dar dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations. The minister reminded him that the tunnel represented political triumph, not scientific caution. Any mention of strange phenomena would risk halting the project, which was unacceptable. Malik's entries conveyed a sense of suffocation, not just by the tunnel, but by the pressure to remain silent. As the project continued, Malik's entries became more fragmented. He wrote about blueprints that had been altered without authorization, subtle changes indicating reinforced walls in areas where reinforcement should not have been needed. He wrote about receiving geological reports that contradicted earlier surveys, yet no one would explain the discrepancies. Most disturbing was his discovery of unofficial markings inside the tunnel, symbols carved crudely into the stone, appearing overnight, resembling warnings rather than graffiti. Malik wrote of dreams too, dreams where he was trapped inside the mountain, surrounded by darkness so complete that he couldn't tell whether his eyes were open or closed. In these dreams, something was moving toward him. Something walking. Something aware. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced the dream wasn't a dream at all but a memory of what was trapped behind the sealed walls. The most haunting entry came weeks before the tunnel's completion. Malik described witnessing a section of fresh concrete bulge outward slightly, as if something pressed against it from inside. When he returned with additional staff, the bulge was gone, replaced by a smooth, flawless surface. He questioned his sanity but noted the event carefully, writing, "Concrete does not move on its own. Something pushed it." Near the end of the first diary, Malik wrote of a confrontation with Minister Dar. He had begged for additional reinforcement, claiming the stability of the sealed section was compromised. Dar threatened to remove him from the project. Malik reluctantly backed down, but the defeat scarred him. His words reflected hopelessness. "I've built many structures in my life, but never have I been forced to build around something I do not understand." The second diary was darker, its pages filled with uneven handwriting, ink smudges, and broken thoughts. Malik described hearing whispers in the tunnel when alone. He insisted they came from the walls themselves. He wrote that the workers' disappearance haunted him, that he believed they were not victims of collapse but victims of something much older than the tunnel itself. Something the mountain had sealed long before humans ever attempted to carve through it. One entry, found halfway through the diary, chilled the engineers when they read it: "We did not build the tunnel through empty rock. Something was already here. We have disturbed it." And then came the final entry. It began coherently: "I fear the ministers know more than they admit. There are records, older than any geological study, suggesting forbidden chambers in the mountain. This wall, it is not a barrier we built. It is a door we covered." The last line ended abruptly, written as though Malik had been interrupted mid-sentence: "If it ever begins to move again, then," there was nothing more. The page ended with a streak of ink trailing off the edge, as if the pen had been snatched from his hand. The engineers who discovered the diaries sat in stunned silence. Everything they had suspected, the odd movement, the strange history, the unexplained deaths, suddenly felt connected. Malik hadn't been paranoid. He had been aware. Tragically aware. And now, decades later, the movement behind the sealed wall had returned exactly as he warned it might. Whatever Malik feared, was waking again. Dr. Sophia Rahman never expected her research to intersect with a decades-old engineering mystery. She wasn't an engineer, nor did she have any interest in modern infrastructure. Her world revolved around history, specifically, early civilizations and forgotten mining cultures that once shaped the region's mountainous landscape. She was methodical, fiercely passionate, and known for pursuing leads that most academics considered too obscure to matter. But her curiosity was exactly what made her the perfect person to uncover what everyone else had overlooked. It began when she received a request from the Cultural Preservation Board to review geological archives near the tunnel site. The board wanted to ensure that upcoming renovations wouldn't disturb any historically significant formations. Sophia initially dismissed the assignment as routine. But as she sifted through crumbling manuscripts, weathered maps, and brittle excavation logs, she found something that stopped her cold. At the bottom of a folder labeled "Pre-Modern Cave Networks," she found sketches, hand-drawn diagrams dating back several centuries. They depicted a sprawling underground system of chambers and narrow passageways beneath the same mountain the modern tunnel now pierced. But what caught her attention wasn't the age of the sketches. It was a symbol repeatedly drawn along the deepest passage, a crude warning mark resembling a coiled figure surrounded by vertical lines, bars, perhaps. The more she studied it, the clearer it became that ancient miners had intentionally sealed off certain chambers. Her research led her to old folklore, the kind passed orally across generations, rarely written down. Villagers once believed the mountain housed those who were buried but never died, trapped in darkness after a catastrophic collapse. Songs told of miners who dug too deep, awakening something beneath the earth. Most dismissed the tales as mythology shaped by hardship, but Sophia saw patterns. The stories described rhythmic knocking, unexplained tremors, and the belief that some beings beneath the mountain adapted to survive in eternal darkness. Intrigued, she sought out topographic comparisons between the ancient sketches and the modern tunnel. When layered together digitally, the results were alarming. The sealed corridor inside the tunnel aligned perfectly with one of the ancient hollow chambers marked with the warning symbol. More disturbingly, the chamber's shape matched the seismic footprint of the space currently registering movement. This revelation brought Sophia to the tunnel facility. She met with Dr. Layla Siddiqui and requested access to the seismic logs. Layla was skeptical at first, but when Sophia showed her the old maps, the ones clearly predating the tunnel by centuries, the engineer's skepticism turned to unease. The ancient chamber and the sealed modern section overlapped too precisely to be coincidence. Sophia continued digging deeper, both figuratively and literally. She traveled to remote villages surrounding the mountain and spoke with elders who remembered fragments of forgotten lore. One old man, eyes clouded with age, whispered to her that the mountain had been closed by those who feared what lived beneath it. Another claimed his grandfather once worked on the early mines and returned pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. He warned Sophia not to disturb old stories, saying, "Darkness remembers those who seek it." What unsettled Sophia most was a recurring theme: warnings against breaking sealed chambers. According to folklore, the ancient miners had deliberately collapsed sections of the mine to imprison something inside. They believed it was necessary, an act of containment, not abandonment. Armed with this knowledge, Sophia returned to the tunnel and asked permission to inspect the sealed wall area from a safe distance. When she arrived, she noticed things others had overlooked: the slight curvature of the wall which did not match the rest of the tunnel's design, the reinforced layering suggesting rushed construction, and the faint temperature difference in the surrounding air. It all pointed to one conclusion: this section wasn't just sealed, it had been buried. Her breakthrough came when she found an old geological chart hidden in an unmarked archive box. The chart displayed early drilling notes from the tunnel's initial surveys. Most of the markings were standard: density readings, fault lines, erosion predictions, but in the center of the sealed section, someone had drawn a circular shape in red ink. Next to it were 3 handwritten words: "Do not disturb." But the most chilling discovery Sophia made was the partially restored fragment of an ancient map. It showed the hollow chamber beneath the mountain, elongated, misshapen, wider at one end, and beneath it, written in archaic script, was a phrase she translated as, "They breathe still." The phrase haunted her. It created a bridge between ancient warnings and modern anomalies. If the ancients believed something had survived underground, what did that imply about the movement detected today? She shared her findings with Layla, who listened in grim silence. Sophia wasn't a person prone to dramatic conclusions, yet even she struggled to explain what the data implied. Either the ancient miners had fabricated an elaborate myth that coincidentally matched the sealed tunnel's behavior, or the myth had been rooted in something real. As Sophia walked the length of the tunnel's forbidden section, her footsteps echoing softly, she felt an inexplicable pressure in the air. A sense of presence, intangible, but unmistakably real. She paused, staring at the thick concrete wall that separated the living world from the sealed void beyond it. Her breath caught when she noticed faint marks, barely visible unless the light hit them from a specific angle. They looked like scratches. Not old ones, fresh ones. Her heart pounded. She stepped back instinctively, her mind racing with the implications. Someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way out. She reviewed her maps again that night, tracing the chamber's outline with shaking fingers. The seismic activity aligned with the very spot where ancient miners had placed their warning symbol. The movement behind the sealed wall wasn't random. It followed the shape of the chamber. It followed patterns of pacing. It followed a rhythm. She met Layla again the next morning and told her with quiet conviction, that space behind the wall, it's not natural. And it's not empty. Layla didn't argue. She didn't need to. Because the map Sophia brought with her, the one older than any modern survey, contained a chilling annotation describing the chamber's purpose, a place of imprisonment. And the seismic readings showed that whatever had been imprisoned, was awake. The first sign that something had changed came just past midnight, an hour when the tunnel was usually a hollow, echoing void of distant engine hums and the soft drip of condensation. A night shift technician named Bilal was the first to notice the alert, a sudden spike in seismic activity, stronger than anything recorded since the sensors were installed. At first, he assumed it was a malfunction. He tapped the screen, refreshed the feed, rebooted the monitor. The readings didn't fall. They climbed. The pulses were no longer faint or rhythmic like footsteps. They were heavier, more forceful. They resembled someone, or something, pushing with deliberate strength against the sealed wall. The pressure waves hit in intervals too controlled to be a collapse. Too organized to be geological. And too familiar to ignore. By the time Dr. Layla arrived, summoned urgently from her quarters, the sensors were lighting up in rapid succession. Heat maps showed intensified activity along the central axis of the sealed chamber, aligned with the exact point where the ancient mining map indicated the chamber's widest opening. Layla stared at the display, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. The movement was unmistakably accelerating. Not randomly. Purposefully. What triggered this? She demanded. Bilal hesitated. Nothing external, he said. Nothing from traffic. No pressure changes. It just started increasing on its own. Layla leaned closer to the screen. The pattern wasn't pacing anymore. It wasn't shifting back and forth. The movements clustered near one specific section of the wall, almost as if whatever was inside had turned to face it. As if it sensed something outside. As if it was preparing. Suddenly, another monitor chimed, a sound detection alert. The acoustic sensors, which had been quiet for days, captured a low, drawn-out vibration. Layla replayed it. The waveform stretched across the screen in slow, undulating curves. At first, it sounded like static. But when the technicians filtered out background noise, the structure became clear. It resembled breathing. Labored. Deep. Slow. Yet impossible. A sealed concrete chamber with no human access point should not contain air circulation, let alone a source capable of producing such audible respiration. The small control room fell silent. Some technicians instinctively stepped back from the monitors, as though the sound itself carried danger. Layla forced herself to remain steady. She adjusted the frequency isolation, amplifying the core vibration. The sound grew louder, softer at first, then rising into a low, resonant hum. But this time, the hum wasn't random. It followed a pattern. A rising and falling cadence, almost like a heartbeat echoing through stone. The kind of sound that didn't belong in an empty chamber. And then came the second anomaly. A temperature alarm blipped on the environmental control panel. The sealed section's surface temperature, recorded through embedded sensors, began dropping. Slowly at first, then rapidly. 3 degrees. 6 degrees. 9 degrees. The wall became unnaturally cold, frost-like readings forming within the concrete. The older engineers looked on in dread, recognizing something they had witnessed decades earlier, but never dared explain. Dust began falling from the tunnel ceiling. At first lightly, then in small showers. The sealed wall trembled as though something behind it pressed outward. Not enough to crack it. Just enough to warn them. One of the night guards, standing near the sealed corridor, radioed in with panic in his voice. "There's a sound here," he whispered. Like something dragging inside the wall. Layla and 2 technicians rushed to the sealed section. The corridor was dim, the emergency lights casting long shadows that made the wall appear even more ominous. A faint vibration pulsed beneath their feet. The air felt charged, thicker, heavier, as though saturated with invisible pressure. And then, without warning, a deep thud echoed from behind the wall. The sound was so loud that dust burst out of the hairline seams in a thin cloud. The guard stumbled backward. Layla froze, her breath catching in her throat. The thud wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A strike. A message. Before anyone could speak, a second thud came, stronger than the first. And then a third. 3 knocks. Slow. Heavy. Intentional. Like someone answering a call. The corridor lights flickered violently. The temperature dropped again. For a brief moment, the entire sealed section seemed to pulse outward, as though inhaling. Layla forced herself to step closer despite her shaking legs. She placed her hand against the cold concrete surface. It was icy, far colder than any internal tunnel environment should ever be. And then she felt it. A faint vibration beneath her palm. Too steady to be structural. Too measured to be random. It felt like movement. Behind her, a technician shouted her name. She jerked her hand back as the vibration intensified, growing sharper, almost desperate. The seismic monitors in the control room spiked so violently that the system issued an emergency alert. The wall was withstanding force from the inside, force large enough to resemble a push. The sealed chamber, silent for decades, now trembled with renewed life. Cameras in the corridor captured dust falling in cascading sheets. The hum grew louder, deeper, until it resonated through their bones. Layla's mind raced as she tried to understand the timeline. The movement had existed for weeks, quietly pacing. But tonight, it changed. Tonight, it grew stronger. Tonight, it moved with intention. Something behind that wall was no longer dormant. Something was actively trying to reach the outside. And for the first time since the project began, Layla feared the engineers' refusal wasn't just fear of the past, it was fear of something they knew could awaken. Something older than the tunnel. Something buried alive or buried intentionally. She stepped back as the concrete trembled again. Whatever was behind the wall, had sensed them. It had responded. And it was no longer satisfied with pacing in the dark. It wanted out. By the next morning, the atmosphere around the tunnel had shifted from fear to outright panic. News of the previous night's seismic spike and the unmistakable knocks had spread quietly among the staff. Nobody spoke loudly about it, voices stayed hushed, eyes darted toward the sealed corridor, footsteps quickened when passing that section. Even those who hadn't witnessed the events firsthand felt the air change. Something in the tunnel had awakened, and everyone could sense it. The government arrived before noon. Black SUVs rolled into the facility, their tinted windows reflecting nothing but cold authority. A delegation of officials stepped out, led by Minister of Infrastructure Nadim Akhtar, a stern-faced man known for shutting down rumors before they took root. His presence alone told the engineers what was coming. Within the hour, all tunnel activity was halted. Access was restricted. Documents were collected. Cameras were turned off. And every staff member was called into an emergency briefing that felt more like an interrogation. Minister Akhtar stood at the front of the room, flanked by 2 advisors and a military liaison. His tone was sharp, dismissive, and practiced. "There is no structural emergency," he began. "There is no movement behind any sealed wall. The reports you have submitted contain errors and misreadings. Effective immediately, all monitoring of that section is suspended." The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew the data was accurate. Everyone had heard the recordings. And a few had even felt the wall move. Dr. Layla rose slowly, despite the tension tightening her chest. She wasn't fearless, she was exhausted, horrified, and unwilling to let the truth be buried like everything else had been. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but strained, with respect, "the seismic activity isn't a glitch. We've verified it repeatedly. There's movement, consistent movement." "And the wall," Akhtar cut her off sharply. "You are not authorized to speak further on this matter." The room tensed. Layla opened her mouth again, but Raza gently pulled her arm and whispered, "Don't push. You don't know what they already know." And Raza was right. Because the government didn't come to investigate. They came to suppress. Soon after the briefing, 2 security officers confiscated the seismic drives. They collected physical logs, backed up files, and even took personal notebooks from those who had documented data manually. Staff protested, but the officers repeated the same phrase, "National Safety Protocol." It was clear they didn't intend to shut down the tunnel. They intended to shut down the truth. But not everyone was willing to stay silent. That evening, while officials held closed-door discussions, a set of leaked documents surfaced anonymously on a private online server. The files were scanned pages of old government memos, marked confidential, level 4. The timestamp suggested they were written during the tunnel's original construction. And what they revealed made the engineers' fears feel small compared to the decades-long cover-up unfolding before them. The memos described a collapse involving several undocumented workers who were never retrieved. Officials had been aware the men were trapped alive behind the sealed section but deemed rescue impractical and high risk. The decision to seal the wall was not an accident, nor an engineering last resort. It was deliberate containment. But the most alarming memo was the final one, handwritten by a senior advisor. The enclosed chamber presents unusual environmental stabilization. Oxygen remains at survivable levels despite lack of ventilation. Recommend permanent sealing. Do not attempt recovery. The implications were horrifying. The trapped workers might have survived for days, weeks, perhaps longer. The oxygen in the sealed space should have depleted rapidly, yet the memos implied it didn't. Something was keeping the air breathable. Something was maintaining a livable environment inside. Layla trembled as she read the documents. If they survived longer than we thought, she whispered. If they adapted, a technician beside her shook his head violently. No. That's impossible. Humans can't survive for decades underground. But the seismic readings, the pacing, the breathing-like hum, they all hinted at a possibility no one wanted to consider. What if the workers didn't die immediately? What if they learned to survive in the darkness? What if isolation, starvation, and total sensory deprivation changed them? The leaked files spread rapidly among the staff, causing panic to simmer beneath the surface. Some believed the workers had mutated or evolved to endure the sealed chamber. Others feared something far older had been inside the mountain long before the workers were trapped, and the workers had simply encountered it. Either way, the government had known. They had known the chamber wasn't just a sealed pocket of rock. They had known oxygen levels were unnatural. They had known movement had been detected once before, years after construction. They had known something was inside. And now, with the recent seismic readings, they feared the same thing the engineers feared: it was still alive. The shutdown order only confirmed it. Officials wanted to smother any evidence of what lay behind the wall, not out of ignorance, but out of recognition. Near midnight, as staff quietly packed their belongings, an older engineer whispered to Layla, "If they shut us down, it means they're afraid. They think whatever's in there might get out." Layla didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because she knew, everyone knew, that governments don't silence the truth unless the truth is far more dangerous than the lie. And if something behind the sealed wall was reaching out, knocking louder each night, then the lie had already begun to crumble. The order to open the sealed section did not come from the government, at least, not officially. It came from the pressure that no administration could suppress forever, fear spreading among the staff, whispers escaping the facility, leaked documents circulating online, and the raw, undeniable evidence of movement increasing behind the wall. Public outcry grew as rumors of trapped workers resurfaced. Families of missing laborers demanded answers. Journalists camped outside the facility gates. The story began slipping beyond the government's control. Within days, the minister shifted his stance. A small, inspection port would be drilled, strictly for structural assessment, not entry. Cameras would be inserted. Nothing more. Everything would be recorded under strict supervision, and the engineers involved would be bound by immediate non-disclosure agreements. But everyone understood the truth: this wasn't a structural check. This was fear disguised as procedure. And the government needed to know one thing: what exactly was behind that wall? Dr. Layla was assigned to the operation despite her declining health and sleepless nights. She tried to protest, but officials insisted that she had the most knowledge of the seismic patterns. They framed it as a compliment, but it sounded more like a sentence. She felt trapped between scientific responsibility and the instinctual dread that had been growing inside her for weeks. The inspection team gathered at dawn inside the dim corridor leading to the sealed section. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the mountain itself was awake and listening. Workers spoke quietly or not at all. Even the drilling crew, rugged men who had spent years cutting through stone, seemed unusually tense. Some avoided looking directly at the wall. Others muttered small prayers under their breath. Before starting, the team set up 2 cameras, one facing the sealed section, the other recording the crew. A security officer repeated protocol in a cold, mechanical voice. No one asked questions. No one dared. The portable drill was positioned against the concrete. The machine's steel bit gleamed under the flickering overhead lights. The plan was simple: drill a narrow borehole, create a thumb-sized opening, insert a fiber optic camera, and assess the interior environment. If the cavity was empty or filled with rubble, the case would be closed. If it wasn't. No one finished that sentence. Layla stood back, monitoring the seismic readings as the drill activated. A loud metallic whine filled the corridor, echoing down the long tunnel like a warning horn. Dust scattered. Vibrations rippled through the floor. The sound seemed to provoke a reaction from inside the wall. At first, the seismic monitor flickered with faint tremors, small pulses, almost curious. Then the pattern shifted. The pulses grew more rapid. Then stronger. And then, suddenly, they stopped altogether. Everything inside the sealed chamber went dead silent. The drill operator paused, startled. It just stopped. Layla's voice tightened. Keep going. But slower. For minutes, nothing happened. The drill advanced steadily, chipping away concrete that hadn't been touched since the 1970s. The deeper it dug, the colder the air around it became. A thin mist formed around the drill head, as if the temperature difference was extreme. Suddenly, the drill bit jerked. The operator cursed under his breath. That wasn't concrete. Layla rushed forward. What was it? The operator stared at the bit. It wasn't spinning cleanly, something had pushed back. Something dense, yet not stone. A hollow knocking sound echoed faintly from inside. Once. Then twice. Then a slow, dragging scrape. The drilling crew froze. Someone dropped a wrench. A technician whispered shakily, "It knows." The minister's representative, trying to maintain authority, barked at them to continue. But his voice trembled too. The drill resumed. Concrete dust swirled into the air like pale smoke. Minutes passed. The borehole deepened. The hum of the machine grew softer as it approached the inner cavity. And then it happened. A sudden, violent impact slammed against the inside of the sealed wall, so powerful that dust burst from the seams and cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. The crew staggered backward. One man shouted. The drill tipped sideways. The seismic monitor blared with red alarm signals. The wall had been hit back. Hard. Someone inside, something inside, knew they were drilling. The minister's representative panicked. Shut it down. Stop drilling. But it was too late. Another blow struck from inside, heavier than the first. The lights flickered wildly. Cracks deepened. A low, guttural vibration swept through the corridor, like a growl reverberating through stone. The team fell into chaos, but the operator, running on instinct rather than reason, delivered the final push, and the drill broke through. A thin burst of freezing air exploded from the newly formed opening. The temperature plunged instantly. Frost formed on the metal scaffold. A mist rolled out from the borehole, dense, white, and colder than any natural underground draft should ever be. Silence. Every member of the team held their breath. Then, slowly, impossibly, a shape pressed against the inside of the concrete. A dark imprint spread outward just beside the opening. The dust-covered wall shifted slightly under the pressure. And then they saw it. A handprint. Not fresh, existing behind the outer layer. Large. Distorted. Fingers too long. palm too broad. Pressed deep into the concrete from the inside out. The crew stumbled away in horror. One man fainted. Another bolted down the corridor, dropping his flashlight as he fled. Layla's knees weakened. Her pulse hammered. Her mind refused to accept what she was seeing, yet her eyes could not look away. Something inside the chamber had touched the wall. Something with a hand larger than any human's. Something that had been waiting. The borehole camera was ready, but none of the crew wanted to insert it. The minister's representative demanded it be done. No one moved. Finally, with trembling hands, Layla took the camera herself. She didn't know why, maybe fear mixed with duty, maybe the desperate need for truth. She moved slowly toward the borehole, mist swirling around her. A faint scraping could be heard from inside, like fingernails dragging across stone. Just as she lifted the camera toward the opening, a shadow shifted behind the borehole. A single, sudden movement. Something rushed toward the opening. The feed on the portable monitor went black. Screams erupted. Several crew members ran. The corridor lights blew out, plunging everyone into darkness. And then a sound emerged from the sealed chamber. Not knocking. Not breathing. But a slow, rising exhale, deep and resonant, like something taking its first breath in decades. Moments later, emergency generators kicked in. The lights flickered back to life. The borehole now oozed cold mist. The camera cable was torn. Layla was on the ground, unconscious. And the wall. The wall was no longer silent. It pulsed, just once, like something enormous shifting behind it. The operation was immediately terminated. The corridor was evacuated. Security sealed the area. And the government issued a new directive: no one was to approach the wall again. Not under any circumstances. But the damage was already done. The wall had been opened. The thing behind it had moved. And whatever waited inside the darkness had finally realized that the outside world was reaching for it. Now, it was reaching back. The tunnel was sealed again within hours, steel plates welded over concrete, guards stationed along every entrance. The government announced a structural anomaly, nothing more. But the engineers who had stood there, the ones who heard the breathing, saw the handprint, felt the wall pulse, knew the truth would never fit inside an official report. Dr. Layla never recovered. She vanished weeks later, leaving only her notes behind. Whistleblowers whispered that movement still registers behind the sealed plates, stronger than before. And though no one dares return, the final seismic reading remains a warning: whatever was inside is no longer sleeping.